The invitation had been a mistake. Sloane hardly knew it the moment she walked through the gilded doors of the Palmer House ballroom and felt the air change around her. That particular shift in atmosphere that happened whenever a woman who didn't quite fit stepped into a room full of people who'd spent their whole lives deciding who did. She smoothed the front of her burgundy dress, a deep wine-colored wrap that her friend Daphne had helped her choose 2 Saturdays ago at a boutique on Michigan Avenue. "You look stunning," Daphne had said, and Sloane had believed her right up until this moment. Standing at the threshold of the Chicago Museum Foundation's annual acquisition gala, surrounded by women who seemed to have been assembled from a single template, thin, blonde adjacent, draped in black. Sloane was 31 years old, 5'4", and what her mother gently called substantial. She had a master's degree in art history from Northwestern, a position as senior acquisitions coordinator at the Field Museum, and the kind of quiet competence that made her invisible to everyone except the donors who actually wanted their collections properly catalogued. She was good at her job. She was good at most things. She had simply learned, over the years, not to expect anyone at events like this one to notice. She picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and made her way toward the impressionist wing, where newly acquired Mosoriso was on display. The crowd was dense and perfumed, full of architects and philanthropists, and the particular brand of wealthy Chicagoan who collected art the way other people collected frequent flyer miles. Sloane had catalogued donations from half the people in this room. None of them would recognize her face. That was fine. She'd made peace with that a long time ago. What she had not made peace with, what she would never fully make peace with, she suspected, was the voice that found her 20 minutes later near the East Gallery corridor. Sloane. She turned before she could stop herself. The way you always turn when someone says your name with that particular brand of ownership. And there was Garrett Wyndham, looking exactly the way he always looked. Broad-shouldered, easy-smiled, the kind of handsome that photographed beautifully and felt hollow up close. He was standing with 2 people she didn't know, a woman in a white column dress and a man in a charcoal suit. And he was already smiling the way people smile when they're about to say something that hurts you and want it to look accidental. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I work here," Sloane said. "Not here, but adjacent." "Right." He glanced at the woman beside him, something passing between them too fast to catch. "This is Paula. Paula, this is Sloane Mai." He paused just long enough. "We used to date. Paula was beautiful in the effortless way that some women are beautiful, the kind that comes with cheekbones and metabolism, and a certainty that rooms are meant to welcome you." She smiled at Sloane with polite vacancy. "I thought you were still doing the grad school thing," Garrett said. "I graduated 4 years ago." "Right." He nodded, looking past her toward the Morisot. "You look another pause, shorter this time, but Sloane had known Garrett Wyndham for 3 years, and she knew what lived inside his pauses. "You know, you should really try that place I sent you, the Pilates studio. They do a program specifically for—" He gestured vaguely at her, at all of her, for people who want to make a change. The woman in white found something fascinating to look at across the room. The man in charcoal shifted his weight. Sloane felt the familiar heat climb her throat, the one she'd been managing since she was 14 years old, and her aunt had pulled her aside at Christmas to discuss her health. She felt her fingers tighten around her glass. She felt 20 different responses rise and die in her chest. What she said was, "Excuse me," and she turned. And she walked, because sometimes that was the only power you had, the direction of your own feet. She made it to the far end of the corridor before she stopped walking, pressing herself into a shallow alcove beside a stone column, breathing carefully through her nose. The sounds of the gala continued behind her, laughter and clinks of glass, and the low murmur of money talking to itself. Sloane stared at a small bronze piece on a pedestal, a woman's torso, rounded and unashamed, from the museum's permanent collection, and she thought, not for the first time, that art had always been kinder to bodies like hers than people were. "He's not worth the cortisol." The voice came from her left, low and unhurried, and Sloane turned to find a man she'd never seen before standing against the opposite wall of the alcove as if he'd been there for some time. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind men exaggerated, with dark hair silvering at the temples and the particular stillness of someone who'd never needed to fill a room with noise because the room always noticed him first. His suit was charcoal, bespoke in the way that had nothing to do with cost and everything to do with fit. He was holding a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. He was looking at her the way very few people had ever looked at her, directly, without apology, without the slightly pained adjustment that people made when they were trying to seem polite, while also calculating. Sloane blinked. "I'm sorry? The man who just spoke to you," he said. "He's not worth the cortisol, the stress hormone." A pause. "You knew what I meant?" "I did," she said. "I have a biology minor." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then you know that spending it on him is a waste of your body's resources." She didn't know whether to be charmed or unsettled. She landed somewhere in between. "Were you listening? I was standing here first. He found you in my direction." He said it, without defensiveness, simply recounting a fact. "I didn't intend to overhear. I couldn't avoid it." Sloane looked at him for a moment. "He told me I should try a Pilates studio." I heard. He made it sound like a kindness. "It's what men like that do," he said. "They deliver cruelty in the packaging of concern so that you end up thanking them for the wound." The accuracy of it landed somewhere behind her sternum. She exhaled slowly. "That's a very specific observation. I've met a lot of men like that." He pushed off the wall slightly, extending one hand. "Dominic Farrell." She shook it. His grip was firm without performing firmness. "Sloane Hartley, you work with the museum. How did you? You knew exactly where to go to be alone," he said. "The back corridors aren't on the public map. You've been here before, many times, and when he said you work here, you didn't correct the geography with embarrassment. You corrected it with precision." He looked at her steadily. "You like your work." Sloane stared at him. In 15 years of professional life, approximately no one at events like this one had said that to her. "You like your work," as though it mattered, as though the liking of it was a fact worth noting. "Senior Acquisitions Coordinator," she said. "Field Museum, the Morisot piece." He glanced toward the gallery. "Technically through my hands. I authenticated the provenance documentation." She paused. He said it without elaboration, which somehow communicated more than a full explanation would have. "The Foundation asked me to be here. I find events like this." He paused. "Loud, me too." He looked at her again in that way, the direct way, and Sloane had the strangest sensation of being seen all the way through and found not wanting but interesting. It was a feeling so unusual she almost didn't know what to do with it. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. It was something else, an offering, extended with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to being taken up on his offers, but who wouldn't be diminished if she declined. Sloane looked back toward the main gallery. Garrett was somewhere in that crowd. Paola in her white dress. The Pilates studio. The pause. "All right," she said. They walked the eastern galleries for 40 minutes. Dominic Farrell turned out to know an unreasonable amount about mid-century figurative sculpture and had opinions about the Art Institute's recent acquisition strategy that were sharp and specific and, Sloane thought, largely correct. He asked her questions and then waited for the full answers, which was rarer than people imagined. He didn't check his phone. He didn't let his gaze slide over her shoulder when more attractive options passed. He was, Sloane thought, the most genuinely attentive person she'd spoken to in 3 years, possibly longer. She found out, in pieces, that he was 43, that he ran a private equity firm headquartered on Wacker Drive, that he had 2 younger sisters he spoke about with unguarded warmth, and that he hadn't attended a social event voluntarily in approximately 14 months. She found out that he'd been standing in that alcove because the main crowd had become, in his words, relentless. She did not find out. Not that night. The full scale of what Dominic Farrell meant when he said he invested. Garrett found her again at 9:20 near the coat check. He'd had more to drink since their conversation in the corridor. She could tell by the way his confidence had expanded past its usual borders into something looser and less careful. "Hey," he said, catching her elbow. "I didn't mean to be weird earlier. The Pilates thing, I just meant it as a suggestion. I know what you meant it as," Sloane said. "Don't be like that." He looked past her, and then his gaze traveled to the man standing just behind her left shoulder, and something shifted in his expression, some quick recalibration, the way a person moves when they suddenly realize the ground has different gravity than expected. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see." "Garrett Wyndham," Dominic said from behind her, and his voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but weighted in a way it hadn't been in the galleries, as if he'd simply removed a filter and was letting the actual timber through. "I know your firm. Wyndham Capital, the River North office. You had a deal fall apart last spring. The Hendricks portfolio." Garrett blinked. "Yes. How do you?" "I was on the other side of that table," Dominic said simply. "Briefly, before we declined." There was a silence that Sloane could only describe as structural, the kind that holds weight. "Right," Garrett said. He was looking at Dominic with the expression of a man who'd just understood something retroactively, some calculus that had previously been invisible. "Right. I remember hearing your name mentioned." He laughed, short and recalibrated. "Small world." "Very," Dominic agreed pleasantly. Garrett glanced at Sloane. The confident ease he'd carried in the corridor was entirely gone, replaced by something more careful, more managed. "I'll see you around, Sloane." She said. He left. Dominic moved to stand beside her, watching the crowd close around Garrett's retreating form. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Sloane said, and was surprised to find she meant it. He asked for her card before she left. Not her number, her card, which he examined with actual attention, reading both sides, before placing it precisely in the interior pocket of his jacket. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "If you're willing. You could just have asked for my number." "I asked for the thing you give professionally," he said. "Because I intend to respect the version of you that exists professionally, not only the version that was kind enough to talk to me in a corridor." He looked at her steadily. "There's a difference." Sloane Hartley, who had a biology minor and a master's degree and 15 years of practice at managing the way rooms looked at her, did something she hadn't done in quite some time. She smiled, not the managed, polite smile she kept ready for events, but the real one, the one that took up more space. "Dinner," she said. "Yes." He called, actually called, not texted, 2 days later, and they had dinner at a small Italian place in River North that had no social media presence and where the host knew Dominic by a nod rather than a name. Sloane ordered the rigatoni with short rib ragu, and Dominic did not comment on the order, did not glance at it, did not make any of the small unconscious adjustments that some men made when a woman ordered food without apology. He ordered the same. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about her work, the actual work, the archival research, the chain of custody documentation, the particular satisfaction of tracing a piece back through a century of hands. He listened the way he had in the gallery, completely, without performing listening. He asked follow-up questions that built on earlier answers, which meant he'd been retaining what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn. She told him, somewhere in the second hour, that she had hypothyroidism, that she'd had it since she was 23, that it had changed her body in ways that no amount of Pilates would correct, and that she'd spent the better part of a decade alternately fighting that fact and trying to accept it. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things without preemptive apology. Dominic listened. Then he said, "That must have required a significant amount of recalibration." "It did, and now?" She considered. "Now I mostly just live in my body instead of negotiating with it." He nodded slowly, as if she'd said something worth keeping. "That sounds like hard-won wisdom." "It was hard-won," she said. "It was not elegant. The best things rarely are. 4 weeks passed. Dinner became 2 dinners, then a Sunday afternoon at the Art Institute where Dominic stood in front of a cassette for 9 minutes without speaking, and Sloane decided that whatever else he was real. He brought her a book, an out-of-print catalogue from a 1987 Morisot retrospective, left at her office front desk with no note, just her name on the envelope in handwriting that was particular and unhurried like the man himself. She did not think about Garrett Wyndham. She had mostly not thought about Garrett Wyndham since the coat check, which felt like a gift she hadn't known she was waiting to receive. And then on a Tuesday morning in November, her colleague Prisha dropped by her office with the expression of someone carrying news they weren't sure counted as good or bad. "Did you see the Tribune business section?" Sloane had not seen the Tribune business section. She looked at it now on Prisha's phone, a quarter-page item in the financial column, under the headline Farrell Capital acquires Wyndham portfolio assets following Q3 restructure. The item was 3 paragraphs. The third paragraph mentioned that Wyndham Capital's River North office would be absorbed, the firm dissolved, and its principals, including founder Garrett Wyndham, transitioning out of their roles effective December 1st. Sloane read it twice. She thought about Dominic standing at the coat check, the particular quality of his pleasant in very, and she understood something she hadn't understood then. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "Sloane, the Tribune," she said. A pause. "Yes, that was already in motion when we met." "It was already in motion before you were hired at the Field Museum," he said. "It had nothing to do with you. Wyndham's firm had structural problems that predated any of this. Dominic, I did not move faster because of what I overheard in a corridor," he said. "I want to be precise about that. What he said to you was..." He stopped. Then, "I have 2 younger sisters. Both of them have spent their lives being told their bodies are problems to be solved. What he said to you was not new information about men like him. It was confirmation of information I already had about that specific deal." Sloane sat at her desk, the museum quiet around her, her coffee cooling, the November sky making the window into a grey rectangle. "I believe you," she said, because she did. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I wanted to. I wasn't sure of the..." He paused. The geometry of how to say I've been professionally disentangling from the man who was unkind to you without it sounding like I'm claiming credit for something that was never about you." Sloane was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went by on Columbus Drive. Somewhere down the hall, someone was running a document through the large format scanner. "Have dinner with me tonight," she said. "You can explain the geometry in person." He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. 7 o'clock, 7 o'clock, she agreed. They went back to the Italian place in River North. At some point during the second hour, after they'd said what needed saying, and the geometry had been laid out plainly, and Sloane had told him she didn't need him to have protected her, but she would be lying if she said it had not felt. In some cellular way, like being cared for. At some point after all of that, Dominic reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "You should know that when I look at you, I don't see what he saw." "What do you see?" she asked it quietly without performing the asking. "I see someone who knows exactly what she's worth and has spent years in rooms full of people who didn't." He kept his eyes on her face, steady and unhurried. "That's not a small thing, Sloane. Knowing your own value in rooms that won't confirm it. Most people lose themselves trying to get the confirmation. You didn't." She thought about 14 years old and her aunt at Christmas. She thought about the Pilates studio, the pause, the gesture. She thought about the bronze torso in the museum alcove, rounded and unashamed, and all the centuries of art that had looked at women like her and found not a problem but a subject worth rendering. "I almost did," she said. "There were years where I almost did." "I know," he said. "I can see the almost in you sometimes. The place where you shrink a little before you stop yourself." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I'd like to be one of the people in your life who makes the stopping easier." Sloane looked at Dominic Farrell across a small table in a restaurant with no social media presence, the candle between them throwing uneven light across the planes of his face. And she thought that this was the kind of moment that didn't announce itself, that arrived sideways, without fanfare, and only looked inevitable in retrospect. That, she said, might be the most useful thing anyone has ever offered me. He smiled, a real one, full, the first time she'd seen it completely unguarded, and she understood then that she had been, without intending it, one of the very few people who had ever made Dominic Farrell fully visible to himself. The news about Wyndham Capital ran in the Tribune for 2 days, and then moved on, as financial news does, toward other casualties and other deals. Garrett Wyndham was mentioned in a follow-up piece as transitioning to advisory consulting, which was the language that business journalism used for a particular kind of diminishment. Sloane read the item once and did not save it. She ran into Paola 3 months later at a fundraiser for the Chicago Architecture Foundation. Paola was alone, looking slightly less certain of her welcome than she had at the gala, and she gave Sloane a small, careful nod that might have been apology or might have just been recognition. Sloane nodded back. She had long since stopped needing things from the people who'd looked past her. In January, Dominic took her to see a private collection in a townhouse in Lincoln Park. A friend of his, a retired cardiologist who'd spent 40 years acquiring outsider art, floor-to-ceiling, and completely without irony. The cardiologist, a small man named Howard, who had the particular energy of someone perpetually delighted by the world, shook Sloane's hand and said immediately, "Dominic tells me you do provenance work. I have 11 pieces I've never properly documented. Would you be willing to take a look?" She was willing. She spent 2 hours with Howard's collection, while Dominic sat in an armchair and read with the ease of a man who had no need to be the center of anything. Occasionally she'd call across the room with a question. "Howard, do you know where this one came from originally?" And Howard would answer at length and with enthusiasm, and Dominic would look up from his book with an expression she'd come to recognize, the particular quality of his attention when he was watching her in her element. On the street afterward, walking back to his car through January air, sharp enough to have edges, he said, "You were extraordinary in there. I was doing my job." "Yes," he glanced at her. "You're extraordinary at your job." Sloane tucked her chin against the cold and smiled, the real one, the one that took up space. She'd been using it more frequently. Lately, it turned out it had always fit her face. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything." The alcove. At the gala. She looked up at him. "If he hadn't come back to find me at the coat check, if you'd never had reason to say anything, would you have introduced yourself anyway?" Dominic walked 3 steps before he answered. "I'd been watching you move through that gallery for 45 minutes before he found you in that corridor," he said. "The way you looked at the pieces, the way you moved through the crowd, not avoiding it, just—" He searched for the word, not performing for it. "I'd been trying to find an excuse, and he gave you one. He gave me one." His voice was even, but she heard the thing beneath it. "I prefer not to thank him for it, but there it is." Sloane laughed, a real one, unguarded, visible in the cold air as a small cloud of breath, and Dominic caught her hand through both their coat sleeves and kept it, and they walked the rest of the block like that, in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full. She called her friend Daphne that night from her apartment on Dearborn, the lights of the city making the window into something almost impressionist. "You sound different," Daphne said immediately. "Different how?" "Like someone who stopped waiting for a room to tell them they could come in." Daphne paused. "Is it the man?" "It's not only the man," Sloane said, and that was true. The recalibration had been her own work, years of it, the hard-won and not elegant kind. Dominic hadn't built anything in her. He'd simply been the first person in a long time who could see clearly what was already there. But she said, "He helps." Daphne laughed, delighted. "Good. You deserve someone who helps." After she hung up, Sloane sat for a while in her apartment, in the quiet, in the lamplight, with the city outside doing what cities do. She thought about the burgundy dress, and the gilded doors, and the particular shift in atmosphere that had moved through the room when she walked in. She thought about the alcove and the bronze torso and the man who'd said, "You're not worth the cortisol," about someone who, it turned out, genuinely wasn't. She thought about what it meant to take up space. Not the diminished, apologetic version. Not the version that came with constant monitoring and preemptive explanation. The full kind. The kind the sculptors had always known how to render. The kind that had been there in her all along, waiting for her to stop arguing with it. She had spent a long time believing that the rooms would eventually let her in if she simply waited long enough, tried hard enough, made herself small enough to slip through the gap. She understood now that the rooms had nothing to do with it. She had always already been exactly enough. The only question had ever been whether she believed it before someone worth knowing came along and confirmed what she'd been trying to tell herself for years. And she was getting there. She was, day by day, and dinner by dinner, and gallery by gallery, getting there